Nazis defined the enemies before coming to power in 1933. We know that they defined the Jews as the enemies, but who were the other groups that they defined as enemies?
So the Nazis have a lot of enemies, real and perceived. The first two groups fall under categories that we at the museum like to call enemies of belief or enemies of action. Enemies of belief might be groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, whose refusal to recognize temporal authority, that is the authority of the state over the authority of God, that's their religious conviction, and that puts them at loggerheads with the Nazis. And then you have enemies of action, those whose actions made the Nazis view them as enemies. The Nazis demanded that Germans accept the premises of the Nazi worldview and live their lives accordingly. And they didn't tolerate dissent, criticism, or nonconformity. And so the Nazis persecuted members of resistance organizations and German political opponents. But the Nazis reserved their most extreme persecution for what we might call biological enemies. And most significantly, those are Jews, but also notably the Romani people, who are sometimes referred to as gypsies, although that's pejorative, for discrimination, persecution, and finally, especially in the Jewish case, for systematic destruction. And also in this group of biological enemies are the so-called hereditarily ill. Those are people we call today persons with mental, social, or physical disabilities who the Nazis believed placed a genetic, that's really important, a genetic as well as a financial burden on the state. So those are some of the enemies that the Nazis see ranged around them.
So the Nazi persecution of Roma and Sinti in the category of gypsy really draws on prejudices and stereotypes and forms of persecution that predate the Nazis and are not exclusive to the Nazis, in particular the criminalization of Roma and Sinti, which is widespread in Europe, going back hundreds of years. And so you find, for example, as early as 1899, the German state of Bavaria has established a central office for gypsy affairs to make sure that all police actions are coordinated against Roma. So you see the emergence of the surveillance of Roma. And this meets up with Nazi racism in the 1930s. The Nazis classified Roma as racially inferior, and a number of cities in Germany established concentration camps for Roma starting in 1935.
You mean there were no other people in those concentration camps,
right.
Just Roma?
Mm-hmm. Just for Roma, yes. And those camps end up feeding into the larger concentration camp system over time and eventually to killing centers. They get pulled into the Nazi machinery of persecution. But they start originally with municipal police. And parallel things that are happening on the national level, and then move up and consolidate into the central government and the central forms of persecution.
So one of the tropes against Romas is that they're criminals. Were there any statistics showing that there's high criminality among Roma?
I mean, insofar as Nazi race scientists were seeking to prove that criminality was hereditary, yes, I mean, of course, they produced a number of studies and a number of statistics. Are they reliable statistics? Well, no, I don't. There are no statistics in this period, or I think in general, that could prove to us that there is more criminality among Roma than any other group.
By the way, what's the difference between Roma and Sinti?
Sinti are German-speaking Roma, primarily who live in Germany and Austria, a bit in Western Europe and a bit in Central Europe. On the other hand, a lot of Sinti think of themselves as cousins of Roma, think of themselves as a distinct group, because Roma have a common language that has a variety of different dialects. And the Sinti dialect of Romanes is, of course, completely recognizable as a dialect of Romanes, spoken by Roma as well.
And I guess the Holocaust Museum and other Holocaust institutions, they emphasize Sinti because they were particularly persecuted during the Holocaust as part of the Roma group.
Yes, Sinti have an early experience of persecution because they're the predominant group of Roma in Germany in the 1930s. So their experience with Nazism goes back to the early stages. And the forms of persecution that they suffered are broader because they fell under the domain of the Nazis earlier than other Romani groups in Eastern Europe. And also in the 1970s, the Sinti groups in Germany were very successful in making claims for the recognition of their experience in the Holocaust. And there was a Sinti civil rights movement. And it's a testament to the success of their work in this period and their advocacy for the surviving community that we commonly refer to Roma and Sinti in the context of Holocaust studies.
Racist ideology of the Nazis was introduced to people before they came to power. But I was wondering if there were precedent background for that kind of ideology before the Nazis, or how novel these ideas were. Were there any kind of background or context to that before the Nazi actually right?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, there is this long Christian legacy of religious anti-Semitism, and that comes together in the 19th and 20th century with economic anti-Semitism. But what the Nazis bring with them is the racial anti-Semitism, and that's very particular to the late 19th and early 20th century. People who are anti-Semites begin to argue that Jews are not a religion, but a race. And this comes with what we would call scientific racism, the idea of using science to establish the prejudice of race. And what these individuals argue, and what the Nazis come to believe, is that the Jews are not just a religious confession, they are actually biologically a race of Jews. And that's what's different about this kind of anti-Semitism that the Nazis bring with them when they come to power.
We are getting a lot of feedback when we publish the articles on Iran Wire, and many people, they praise the Nazis. Many Iranians, unfortunately, they praise the Nazis because they were strong and they built this mighty army and power. But many people don't know that some of the first victims of Nazi extermination were Germans with physical and mental disabilities, which is, I think, for many people around the world, especially in Iran, it's the lowest thing you can do as a human being, to kill someone who is physically or mentally disabled. Patricia, could you tell us how did the mentally and physically disabled people became the enemies and they had to be exterminated?
Nazi leaders argue these people made no significant contribution to their society, and their existence places that genetic and financial burden on the state. For people who believe in eugenics, it gains traction after the First World War, which is a terribly humiliating defeat for the Germans. The unprecedented carnage on the battlefield and the economic hardships of the interwar years. And those conditions underscore among the German population the division between healthy, fit, useful Germans who died on the battlefield and those unfit, unproductive Germans who are living in institutions, prisons, hospitals, welfare facilities on the home front. And when the Nazis come to power, their first idea is to forcibly sterilize those whom they consider to have hereditary mental and physical disabilities. In an effort to stamp out these disabilities within the German population, about 400,000 Germans were sterilized as a result of this legislation. When that racial policy and territorial policy begins to escalate, voices within the medical community, and I really feel here that this isn't so much Hitler. Hitler was obsessed with the Jewish question. But here it's really voices within the medical community that begin to call not only for the marginalization and sterilization of individuals with disabilities, particularly in institutions, but for the elimination of those individuals in a society that's headed towards war.
Thinking about the morality of certain actions that happen. You might be so prejudiced to believe certain types of propaganda. But when it comes to killing children, that is something that is beyond any type of moral compass. So how could a state justify these types of actions?
First, I want to say something that's really important and significant about murder of a population. It is one thing to define Jews and Roman Sinti as enemies and quite another to kill them. But I think everyone needs to be really aware that this killing was done clandestinely as far as the German people were concerned. It certainly wasn't done clandestinely in Poland or on the killing fields of the Soviet Union, where they shot communities, Jewish communities and Roman Sinti communities where they lived. But in terms of what the German people saw, they knew about concentration camps in their own soil because they were supposed to know about them. These were places where they would send you if you did not conform or do your things properly. But the concentration camps on German soil, per se, places like Dachau, Mauthausen, are radically different in what they were meant to do. And those people who are murdering, I think I understand what you're saying, Omid, about killing children. And indeed, in the euthanasia program, it's the child euthanasia program that comes first. But I think everywhere that you see killing taking place, people become inured to the killing process.
for 12 years, the Nazi state carried out a campaign against homosexual groups, but I assume the main target was gay men, if I'm not mistaken. So is it because they come basically against the perception of masculinity that the Nazi state was very much in favor of? Or so why gay men and not other sexual minorities?
It's unclear how many men publicly or privately identified as gay, but beginning in 1933, the Nazi regime really harasses and tries to dismantle these communities. There was a paragraph that was called 175 of the German Penal Code that made it illegal. But in 1935, in June of 1935, the Nazis revised paragraph 175 and under this new version of the law, of the statute, a wider range of intimate and sexual behaviors could be and were punished as criminal. And during the Nazi period, the police arrested about 100,000 men for allegedly violating this statute. And about 50% of these men were convicted. And we know that about 10 to 15,000 men were imprisoned in concentration camps as homosexual offenders. And these men were typically required to wear a pink triangle, and they're extremely vulnerable in the concentration camp setting, and an unknown number of them die in the camps during the Holocaust. We have to point out, as you said, that it applies only to gay men. So there was no law against lesbianism in Germany, as well as in many other countries. And indeed, some lesbians are arrested and sent to concentration camps and suffered greatly, but they often fell under another label of belief or action, as I described earlier, that of asocials, people who didn't conform to societal norms.
So I was thinking how all these ideological states, totalitarian governments are kind of based on the idea of the sacred and the profane, and the idea as if the whole idea is to strive for a very pure society and eliminate what is regarded as pollution. So this is something that I also see a lot in both religious and secular senses when it comes to, kind of Islamic Republic's language as well and Nazi state language as well. So this is kind of interesting point.
Yeah, I think that, this is one of the Nazis' most fervent beliefs, that they are the Aryan race, that they are the descendants of an ancient Aryan group that comes from Iran, from your part of the world, and descends into Europe. They are the first speakers of this Proto-Indo-European language. So they're the bringers of culture to Europe. And also, I'm thinking that perhaps all of you Persian speakers there might be thinking, well, we didn't go anywhere. We stayed in Iran where we made this fabulous culture, right? The Persian culture. Looking at this Germany realistically about how Germany and Germans come together doesn't dislodge this idea of racial purity among the Nazis. And they really, truly believe that they are the master race because they are the purest race.
I guess in every session, we have to remind Iranians that the Nazis, they didn't mean Iranians being Aryans.
Right. Exactly.
Iranians were just the dirt and dust that were left behind. And the real Aryans, they moved from India and Iran to somewhere else. So I think some Iranians who sympathize with Nazis and say that we are part of the Aryan race as well, they would be really disappointed if they hear from the Nazis.
As I was thinking about this webinar and reading some of the material, I was thinking a lot about the irony that I see in, this, I guess, pseudo-biological and scientific methods of proving that Jews and Romas and other communities that we're talking about are essentially, in their view, inferior. So I wasn't reading it as they are a burden to the state, but also that their very existence is something to be fearful of. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how the Nazis were balancing this act of taking away all the power and then giving some power in their killing machinery.
I think that's a really interesting point. And with power and fear, this doesn't really apply so much to the disabled, but it certainly applies to the Jew. And I think that's very important to understand. The Jew is at once inferior and also, according to the Nazis, very powerful. They link them with capitalism. They also illogically link them with communism. And the Jew is something else. It is the absolute other and very powerful because it is, many of the ideologues actually discuss the Jews as a pathogen, a germ, which is very interesting in our COVID pandemic scenario that we're all facing now, as a cancer that eats on the German body politic and thus has to be eradicated. It's a thing to be feared and scorned, and it's also a thing to excise and eradicate. And that's that kind of cancer scenario is often used in propaganda to discuss Jews. So I think what you've hit on is a really important point, that particularly Jews are this powerful enemy to be eradicated and not necessarily weak just because they're inferior. Do you want to add something, Krista, especially maybe about Roma and Sinti?
No, I think it's an excellent point, and one that's struck me too, that that on the one hand, Roma are extremely vulnerable. They have no state, they have no territory. They are extremely marginalized before the Nazis come to power, and generally are in communities that keep to themselves, and yet they are cast as a potential threat because of the degeneracy of their blood. And yet they are quite self-contained. And so, yes, I think the ways in which they're cast as a threat and the ways in which they're persecuted are contradictory in many ways.
The Nazis not only vilified groups of people and individuals, but also nations. Especially Poland, that vilified and defined as an enemy. Do you see any similarities between the way that Russian propaganda vilifies Ukraine and, the way that Putin talks about Ukraine being run by neo-Nazis and thugs, and the way that the Nazis vilified Poland?
I'm not sure there's a similarity per se, because it is a bit of apples and oranges. And I guess Putin and his followers are vilifying.
Apples and oranges, they're both fruits, actually. So
it's true. So there is some similarity. Yeah. Putin and his followers are vilifying the Ukrainians and the leaders of Ukraine by calling them Nazis, when it's obvious that that's patently false. The Ukrainians were victims of the Nazis, right? And President Zelensky is Jewish. and the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. The Nazis, but I guess what's similar, the Nazis practiced aggressive war against Poland and the Soviet Union, vilifying Poles and the citizens of the Soviet Union as racially inferior Slavs, and branding the Soviet Union and its leaders as Bolsheviks. But that was part and parcel of Nazis' belief system. It's no less wrong, but I think here it's part and parcel of their ideology, whereas I'm not sure that Putin isn't using this as a vehicle to press some buttons with the Russian people about the Second World War and the great heroic war for the Russians, and somehow setting up the Ukrainians as the villains, which of course they weren't. They were their brothers in arms in that particular conflict.
It's one thing to look back and study these processes in historical contexts, and it's another thing to see them unfold in real time and how quickly these tropes work and how easily they can be made to function and to convince people of the pretext of the actions of the state. So I think in that regard, perhaps there is a similarity. So you think of Sinti in Germany, who had served in the German military in World War I, and then found themselves interned in Auschwitz-Birkenau, must have felt very shocked to find out that they had been brothers in arms and were now enemies. And so I think there's probably something instructive for us in thinking about the experience from both the perspective of the perpetrators, but also from the perspective of the victims in that regard.